Hello gainers, Ralphie here, on location with my walking talks. The grass is green, the flowers are bright. It's early in the summer, so we've got a few white flowers and a few little pink flowers, but importantly enough flowers for the bees to go buzzing about, to pollinate them and to make honey. Honey's tasty. We need honey, but more than the honey, we need the bees. We need the pollinating insects, because if we didn't have the pollinating insects, basically the food supply would collapse. I'm not making this up. The global food supply to humans would collapse, and many countries have become so dependent on supermarkets and so non-dependent on growing own food organically in our gardens, in our allotments. This makes the humanoid collective vulnerable. Vulnerability is something that we need to all address, and it's something that I started to talk about in my last walk-in talk, which was entitled Teaching Ourselves How to Learn, because we often consider that the job of schools to do, and they will teach us some stuff, they'll teach us just enough, but they will not teach us what we really need to empower ourselves. And I'm talking individually, that's our job. And too many people ignore it because there's stuff in television, there's computer games, and there's depressing news, which is why we have depressing news, to keep people in the negative zone and more easily manipulated. Meanwhile, a lot of good stuff is actually happening around the planet. Not that it gets commented on, and not that it gets particularly noticed, until we teach ourselves how to learn to spot it. And when we begin this, first of all, we need to be a bit grown up. We can't jump in too young. Well, it depends on our experience and our ability and how well we know ourselves at a young age, but generally, I'd say you've got to be in your 20s. So that you're an adult, and at this point, you're starting to question. So, seriously gainers, we're always learning when we're questioning, and furthermore, when we follow up these questions by reviewing the answers we're given, or the answers we find. This is important. Whatever our strengths and weaknesses, and this is part of learning, teaching ourselves how to learn, is getting to understand, not just know, but understand what our individual, singular, unique to us, strengths and weaknesses are. If we understand our weaknesses, we are less likely to make bad mistakes. Say, for example, if we know we have a weakness for gambling, then we know to avoid that weakness at all costs, because it's going to get us into financial trouble, because gamblers never win. Only those who invest in gambling businesses win. And that's by invitation only, because that's real life. And understanding our strengths, if we know what our strengths are, whether they be technical, mathematical, creative, and artistic, in making music. If we know what our strengths are, then we can encourage them, we can grow our strengths, we can amplify and be more positive with our strengths, and remove and downsize the risks of the impact of our weaknesses. Now, we're not miracle workers, we're not superheroes, so we can't make any huge, vast, life-changing decisions. I mean, for most folk that doesn't happen very often, if at all. But it's the little things all the time that add up over time. That's what makes the difference. And you don't really notice it first. It's only when we've got a little bit more experience of life and we look back where we've come from, and suddenly we see just how dramatically we've changed. We see that this cynicism, has become more objective and constructive in preserving ourselves from the quackery that goes beyond quackademia. It comes from everybody, and I want to really sort of focus now on when we educate ourselves, when we teach ourselves to learn. We're asking questions, we're exploring the options for answers. We have more opportunity to talk to people and listen to people that we otherwise wouldn't have had contact with in the old days, thanks to the internet. And even though we might not agree with people's opinions or religious ideas, they're always worth listening to and examining so that we understand exactly why. And this is the question, the simple questions. What? That's the question. What? What about this? What about that? Why this? Why that? When was this? When was that? And where? What? Why? How? When? Where? When we incorporate these little simple words into our questions accurately, systematically and routinely, we start to narrow down and amplify the quality of the answers we get. And I'm going to round off by giving you a good illustrative example. I'm going to quantify this. This isn't just kind of some airy-fairy notion here. A number of years ago I was in Egypt. You see, I've had a very interesting life. I have had big adventures. I've travelled to exotic places on a budget, and I've met the most fascinating of people. And I always like to say this: culture shock's not when you go and visit other countries and other cultures. See, culture shock, it's when you go back home to your own society and you see it with a different light that you'd have never have seen it with unless you'd travelled. Am I right? Yes. So there I was in Egypt, and I'm looking at the pyramids at Giza, and it's hoaching with tourists asking about the tombs, this, and can you go and see the tombs, and the guides, they're just ordinary folk trying to make a living. They've got families to look after, they've got children to feed, and they're selling all the tat, and it's like a grotesque circus, to be honest, but still the imposing stature of the pyramids goes way beyond their physical form. Everything physical is the conclusion of an idea, and it's understanding, looking beyond the physical, the skeletal remains of these magnificent stone constructions. I'm not going to call them tombs or monuments, they're constructions, because they were constructed for a purpose. And traditional archaeologists will often say, well, they're tombs, that's it. You know, nothing more to say, nothing more to see. And of course, it doesn't take long to realise that they're bullshitting us. They're liars. And one of the biggest disservices that any scientist, no matter what the discipline, can do to the human collective, for the human condition, is to just tell blatant lies, to shut people up and keep people ignorant. That worked in the old days. It doesn't work now. Not even the proactive suppression of the internet is preventing it happen. This is just, it's too big. It's all happening too fast. Interestingly, there's too few people genuinely want to know. Most folk want pop music, football and donuts. That's fine, as long as we understand that. But the pyramids, small, I didn't even go inside, there's no point, there's nothing to see. You can see that they're a machine of some kind, that they're not tombs at all. But it's when you visit some of the more remote temples, because the Egyptians were tremendous artists. They wrote everything up on the wall, And although much of it has been chipped away over the centuries and over the millennia, many millennia, you can't help but, if you know what you're looking for, you start to see the detail. And what I noticed was in the temple of Sobek, which is the crocodile god, which you can only really access from a riverboat or a helicopter, but we arrived in a riverboat, and we went around the temple, and it was very dramatic, particularly for a Northern European. You know, it's all the desert, you're surrounded by desert. This is very, very exotic. I'm not used to this. And you have the enormity of the stone wall construction, the skill of that construction, still with mortar. But then you start to notice the details in the wall, and having a mobile phone, you see, you can zoom in on what you can't quite see and then examine it later. And I zoomed in at the back of the temple, smaller rooms. And this is where they had their academies, and the crocodile god Sobek was the god of medicine. And at the back of this temple, they had the medical academies for the ancient Egyptians. And I'm looking up at the cartouches which are on the wall, and the frames in which they put the symbols, which have specific meaning in ancient Egyptian, so they can be misinterpreted or mispronounced through modern interpretation. And I'm looking at this array of surgical equipment, and I'm looking at the shape of the scalpels, the scissors, the aneurysm hooks. Yep. And it occurs to me that they are virtually identical in shape and scale to what I'm using as an embalmer. In fact, the person I was with, who's a qualified doctor, who's done a bit of surgery, we're both just standing in disbelief at this layout of surgical tools from thousands of years ago, which are in fact used in modern surgeries. I'm just crossing the road now. And it was a very important moment, because it was the past connecting directly with the present, with tremendous messages going on. And the only thing that was missing really was the ultrasonic drills, which some surgeons use, and ultrasonic saws. But everything else was there. And to be honest, the more you look at the geological evidence, this is the geologists' views of the cuttings and the shapings of stones, not just in ancient Egypt, but all around the world. Wherever you go, you start to see some commonality, you start to see some connectivity, that the past, quite simply, gainers, is not what we've been told it is. We have been systematically lied to by the schools, by the academics. Any academic who has tried to be honest has either been censored or sacked. At times, particularly when it comes to big business, they can be bumped off. I'm not making a judgment, it's real life, it's part of the human condition. Anyway, I hope you found that interesting. I'm Ralphie, a walk and talk, telling you a wee bit about Egypt, and in my next video I'll be telling you a little bit about something else. Hope you've enjoyed this, and we'll see you soon. If you like it, click like and don't forget to subscribe.